Hello everyone. In this topic, we're going to get into the Cisco ASA to firepower migration process and restrictions considerations. Before here, many of you may have been thinking to yourself, I understand you're talking about the general term appliance, and if I'm not mistaken, you've mentioned that there's an ASA that can be a firepower threat defense appliance. There's an actual firepower appliance with firepower threat defense image installed. So some of you might be thinking, well, what if I have myself a classic ASA with the pre-firepower firepower threat defense configuration and image running on it? Well, folks, we're going to tell you in this topic how you're able to take that configuration, migrate it over, at least the configuration migrated over to a firepower threat defense appliance, or even take the configuration over to a firepower based configuration and then bring over the ASA with the firepower threat defense image. So again, two things before we even get started. At bare minimum, just bringing over the configuration, migrating the configuration, or even migrating the configuration and bringing over the appliance with a new image so you can still use your hardware moving forward. So we have, if you will, as the keyword states, a process of 3 phases or 3 steps. I actually think of them more as phases, if you will. That's again going to be backing up like crazy, backing up your existing ASA configuration. Remember, once again, folks, I'm a contractor. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm a consultant. And I always jokingly say that contractors get paid to be blamed, which, by the way, is not really that much of a joke. So when I have to do any types of changes like this, or even marginally similar to this, I am backing up the configuration several different times. Then what you have to do, guys, is ultimately convert that configuration using a tool installed on a lab or a migration-only Firepower Management Center appliance. We're going to get to those details coming up in just a moment. And once that migration, the conversion of the configuration is done, you will bring it back over to either a new production firepower appliance or the ASA that has been re-imaged with the firepower threat defense image on it. Remember, again, ultimately, we'll see a nice little flow chart coming up in a moment, but you absolutely have the ability of reusing your physical ASA for a firepower threat defense install. So here we go, guys. Again, the migration capabilities, there's actually 2 things, quite a bit important things that are happening on this slide. Please note the supported features for migration and then any kind of limitations, which is another way of saying heads up because things might fail on you. So 100%, we have support for our extended access list. But please note, the slide uses a word can. I'm going to use a word must. They must be assigned some way, for example, to an interface or assigned globally. So again, it converts the ASA, only the ASA configuration. And especially, give me a moment because we're going to repeat this, but the ASA configuration that's currently being used or currently being applied. We also have the ability, again, of doing twice NAT and even NAT-based rules that are focusing on network objects. And then this next one, I got to stress, in my sarcasm, I've never said boo-hoo. I wish I could have 2,000,001 elements, but this limitation here is telling you that we can only have 2 million access control entries. Now let me pause for a moment. Again, you know how our industry is. We have so many TLAs, so many 3-letter acronyms. Folks, an access control list is an access control list. Some people call them ACLs, I don't. But the actual lines inside of an access control list, those are called access control entries or elements. So what this is really saying is we can have ACLs that can be migrated so long as they are 2 million or less lines inside of an ACL. And I want to say it again, number one, I've not seen everything, but I've been in some pretty big environments and I've never had that be a limitation for me from my experience. We're also able, as we said here, to do our object groups. I like the keyword any, whether once again they're part of an extended access list or as we said just a moment ago, they are part of a NAT rule. But please be careful, it's only going to be for ACLs that are actually applied to an interface. And by the way, notice, for those of you who really push the boundaries of some of your ACL features on the ASA. You might already know this, but the ASA supports an Ether type ACL or a layer 2 ACL, and they support a web type ACL, kind of a classic web-based traffic access control list. But unfortunately, no matter what those two types of ACLs do, they are not supported in the migration process. And folks, last but not least, you're looking at a minimum OS version on the ASA of 9.1. So maybe you're in a scenario where you have to upgrade your ASA first, so you can then be at a good launching point to do these next steps. And then also, please note, there are certain exceptions here in the configuration that can be migrated. Again, for our ACLs and NAT statements, it's going to be user-based, time ranges, an ACL that is using, for example, a fully qualified domain name. If you're in a TrustSec environment, and don't worry, we're going to talk about that coming up in more detail later, but what is referred to as a security group tag, and then also any per session NAT rules, any specific NAT or just general translations that are on a session-by-session basis. Those are going to be some of the exceptions in the migration from an ASA over to the firepower configuration. So once again, the prerequisites. As we said earlier, as long as you're on 9.1 or later, if you are continuing from our last subject, if you are in a failover pair, you need to make sure that you're bringing over the config of the active unit. If you're in an active failover pair, then again, it's going to have to be in your single context mode. Guys, if you're in a cluster, it's going to have to be the master unit of the cluster. And then last but not least, what's really, really good is we can support our layer 3 routed mode or our layer 2 transparent mode of the firewall operation. And last but not least, I know I said that a moment ago, but I'm being really serious now. We have more information. If this is something that is going to be a large migration project for you, I strongly, strongly encourage you to go out to look at the migration guide to, number one, be reminded of some of these provisions and restrictions, and number two, just to read even more on specific scenarios that might impact your environment. All right, continuing on. Next thing is the firepower device, the device that we are migrating to. We need to have a dedicated firepower management center virtual appliance. That's again a pre-built virtual machine, as we've been talking about before. So folks, this is going to be a separate firepower management center from the one that we're using inside of production. And as we'll see in the flow chart coming up in a moment, we're literally going to install a migration tool and kick off the migration tool. It's a simple little .pl script that we're going to run to do the install. And that PL script is simply incompatible in a production environment. So we need to have this on a separate migration-only virtual firepower management center. And then last but not least, because we're doing a migration-only virtual FMC, we need to make sure that this migration-only virtual FMC and the production firepower management center, or FMC, are running the same version. Also, we do not bring over ASA licenses. Folks, they're simply incompatible. They fall into that classic or to be migrated license model. So again, we have to purchase new firepower threat defense licenses, and we need to make sure that we are getting them specific to firepower, and the firepower feature set, because again, they're not interchangeable. Now, the migration checklist, which I'm going to go over this real quick, because on our next couple of slides, we have actual step-by-step. So you're going to get this a couple of different times. Number one, make sure the prerequisites are met. Make sure, again, that we have a backup of that configuration file. You hear me chuckle quite a bit, because that's going to keep you from getting into a lot of trouble. Make sure, again, your configuration is supported features and supported options, because as we've already discussed, otherwise they're simply not going to be brought over. Make sure, again, we download that Firepower Management Center virtual machine or virtual appliance. That's again going to be the same software revision as our production FMC, because on this lab or migration only FMC, that's going to be where we install that migration tool. And remember, again, this simple little .pl script is not supported, not compatible with a production Firepower Management Center appliance. So here it goes again. Export that config. Really, as we said a moment ago, back it up, then export it. As we said on the CFG or text file. Then we're going to go in and bring it into the migration tool. The migration tool exports it as an SFO file. That's going to be what is understood by the Firepower Management Center V virtual appliance. We'll then be able to go in and take, after this migration report, which by the way, we're going to see what this migration report looks like in a moment, but the output of that, again, is going to allow us to then go into our import tool to ultimately bring it into the managed devices under the Firepower Management Center control. But let me back up for a moment because, again, we're able to import these ACLs that we got originally from the ASA, for example, as our access control policies or even pre-filter policies on the Firepower appliance. And then, folks, last but not least, we're able to apply this newly migrated configuration. And this is what I kept thinking in my mind earlier as I was saying it before. We have the ability, if we want, to re-image the ASA, the original firewall that started this, re-image it with the Firepower Threat Defense image and go in and reuse. Maybe this is the one that we actually end up applying our migrated configuration to. Please don't think that you have to throw away your original ASAs. So now let's get into the way this stuff actually looks inside of the GUI. So our very first step, as we said, is to bring in that configuration that needs to get migrated. That's, as we mentioned, the .cfg or the text file, the .txt file. A lot of the times, let me back up just for one moment, we are talking about going over any kinds of reports or any kinds of conflicts. This is the interface that we're thinking of, inside of the GUI that we were thinking of. There's going to be times, folks, where we need to decide on an action for this step. And that's what they mean by conflict resolution. Do I want to bring again the configuration, the converted configuration, as a pre-filter policy or as actual access control policies? So again, we can decide. Do I want to have as an action for our access rules to be to trust this traffic or to allow this traffic? And give me a moment when we get into actual access control policies, we'll explain the differences between trust and allow. And then, folks, last but not least, we see that migration report that we talked about of actually taking the config file and bringing it over, download import file. That's again going to be the SFO file that will ultimately be placed onto our new Firepower Management Center managed appliance. So, folks, that SFO file that we just downloaded, we're going to import it into another operation. Just like as we were doing our converting, we had to manage certain conflicts. Folks, when we do our importing, we may have to again manage certain conflicts. In this example, we're just simply defining what interfaces, again in certain modes, might be used for different security zones in this example. And then last but not least, we're able to see the actual report of the final status of the migrated configuration file. So please remember, the idea here is I have myself ASAs with classic ASA config. I have met the prerequisites of I'm at least at 9.1 or higher, which even 9.1's been around for quite a while. I understand that of the configuration settings that I've left that I still really need, that all of these configuration settings, access list, NAT configuration, those will be successfully brought over. Some of these remaining configuration settings are incompatible with the migration tool, so once the migration is complete and the new config is applied to a new appliance, I'm able to then go in and manually add those features back in. And then remember again, once we migrate the configuration, we can repurpose the original ASA as long as we install the Firepower Threat Defense image. Thank you very much for listening to the migration of an ASA configuration process.